Okay, good morning to everybody. I have 9 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started this morning. And it looks like we have a few people joining us in the live Zoom feed, so that's good. And probably more will join us, as based on my experience. And so, again, just to sort of cap off where we, or to begin where we are, where we capped off last time, we were into chapter 3 on Tuesday, and we were talking about demand, and on our way to talking about supply, and then putting the supply and demand together. And that will really, once we get through chapter 3, that will be sort of the last of the preliminary chapters that will that sort of track along with chapters you might see in micro course. I know some people take micro and macro together, and I know I'm invariably getting emails from people saying, "Are these courses really different?" Because it's like it's all the same material, and it really is for the first 2 chapters. And in fact, almost every econ textbook, I think I've said this before, almost every intro econ textbook I've seen, micro and macro, they're almost identical, almost word for word. And then they split after that point. So that split for us begins with chapter 6. As I was preparing for class yesterday, I was debating whether or not we would get to chapter 6 today. We may just a little bit, just if we have maybe a few minutes, just to sort of get into that. But I do think on Tuesday we'll have time to get into chapter 6. Certainly not all the way, because I really do want to take our time with chapter 6, since it's so foundational to what we're doing the rest of this macro course. That is, we're covering a lot of the topics that we'll be discussing in this chapter are going to come up again and again: gross domestic product, investment, expenditure, all those kind of taxes, all those kinds of things will be coming up. So on Tuesday, then, I think we'll get done most of chapter 3. That's my expectation. And we'll get into chapter 6, but probably only just a bit of the way into that. So only just the part that I'll talk about in class on Tuesday. And I'll know more after the end of class today as to how much we'll be able to get done on Tuesday. And then that'll sort of frame the discussion of the review for the first exam, which will include whatever part of chapter 6 we're able to get into. Okay, so that's what we'll do. So on Tuesday, then we'll have just a regular class session for probably half an hour. I like to give myself about 45 minutes for a review session, maybe 40. Sometimes it's less than that. This is also your opportunity to ask questions as well. I hope you don't feel like the remoteness of this video feed prevents you from doing that, because and some classes are different. A lot of people like to communicate this way, over Zoom. But I can hear you just fine whenever you do ask questions. So feel free to chime in, ask questions. This is really your time. I mean, I know you've probably heard that before, but it really is your time. And I'll go over what to expect for the exam. So just like this Attend Anywhere format allows you to attend the classes 3 ways: in class, live through Zoom, or on recorded video. You have 3 options for taking the exam: live in class at 9 o'clock on Thursday, next week, week from today, or in one of the testing centers, or online through Brightspace. It'll be available on Brightspace. I'll probably post it just right after this class ends on Thursday, so you'll have it available. And by the way, I'll probably just have the Zoom the Zoom channel open, so that on Thursday, if you want to do it online, you want to ask questions, feel free to do that. I suspect that most people will want to do it online. That's sort of my feeling. But because this is intended to be a physical classroom environment as well, I do have to have a regular class. And some may want to take it in class. You're able to use any notes or whatever kind of resources you've got in order to take the exam. Okay, that's sort of a level playing field for anybody who takes it online or in class. So you shouldn't feel like you're at any kind of a disadvantage if you do come into class in order to take it. Okay, so that's the plan. Nothing really different from where we've been before. And just some questions about how far we'll get into chapter 6. And, and I've used this text before, this OpenStax, this free text. I've used it before, but I've never used it in the Attend Anywhere, which is a new format anyway. So, sometimes it's not always clear how far we get. So just, with each particular chapter and the content that is within each chapter. So there's content in chapter 3 that we're not going to get to. We're not going to talk about price controls, price floors, and price ceilings. We're not going to cover that. We're not going to cover consumer and producer surplus. So those will not be covered. You may want to make a note of that just in case you're reading chapter 3. There's nothing on the exam about price floors and price ceilings. or about the surpluses, consumer, producer, and social surplus. Those will not be covered on the exam. Those are more micro topics anyway, and some instructors choose to discuss those, some do not. So, okay. All righty, well, let's go ahead and pick up from where we left off last time. We were talking about demand, we talked about the law of demand, we talked about the idea that demand is a downward sloping curve that we sometimes just simply draws a straight line, and sort of makes the analysis easier on a PQ plane if we just have a straight line as a downward sloping curve looking something like that. And we said that demand can shift. That is, if you take a look at D for demand, and by the way, one of the mnemonic devices that I mentioned last time was because sometimes people are frankly confused over is demand downward sloping or upward sloping. Just think of demand down as being downward sloping, demand down. So it's a downward sloping curve, always in the first quadrant here. And then supply, the mnemonic device, there's supply to the sky. So it goes in the other direction. And we'll get to supply here in a minute. So those are, if you like mnemonic devices, I know I do, so they may be helpful. And we said that demand is like a snapshot, just click. So D1 is what demand looks like right now, but it could change. And so it could be a rightward shift. So, and again, I like everybody to think about an increase as being a rightward shift, not an increase. And this is going to be particularly useful when we talk about supply, because what looks like something that might be going up is actually going down. So in other words, to the left. And so again, orient yourself to the origin, because that's a critical bit here. If you ever are wondering whether it's demand or supply for that matter, because they're both going to be on the same field of battle. Any increases, just like the number line, away from the origin to the right. Any decrease is to the left. And so a decrease in this direction is a shift. And a shift is a change in the overall function. I gave you some examples of what functions might look like. That is algebraic expressions or equations, I guess. And what we're really saying is that when these things shift, there's a fundamental change in the relationship between price and quantity. And it's based upon these things, these demand shifters. Okay? And we talk about demand shifters, and I think this is really where we left off last time, where we're saying that these are what we call, AKA determinants of demand. And determinants of demand are basically sort of the DNA, the chemical structure of demand, if you like. And these are always, and this is an important thing to be aware of, these are always non-price variables. So when we say demand itself, not a quantity demand change, which is only due to a change in price, that is a movement up and down along the demand curve is only due to a change in price. The demand curve itself changing is due to something that's going on functionally within the demand relationship. That is all the things which go into demand, these determinants of demand. In other words, what is the chemical structure of demand, if you like, whatever kind of metaphor I can use here. And these are non-price variables. So you can't say demand shifts because the price of the good. It could be the price of other goods, and I'll get to that in just a second. So let's talk about what some of the examples are of things which could shift the demand curve. And this is on the PowerPoint slides, which I'm going to probably post sometime tomorrow. I think if I can't get them posted and visible correctly, I'll just simply email them to everybody so that everyone's got them. And all they really are, they sort of serve to frame the discussion. The list of demand shifters is probably pretty good. It may differ a little bit. It may differ a little bit from what's in your text. And in fact, if you were to Google something like determinants of demand, you might end up with even longer list, maybe even twice the size, which would include things like import prices, interest rates, expectations of future taxes. I mean, there are all kinds of things which we're not really going to cover because we're going to try to keep this simple. But and in fact, my list may differ a little bit from the text. But this is what these are some of the ones I think are most important to go off. And the first of these is called the income effect. And we talked a bit about this already in the sense that we talked about types of goods. And if you recall the discussion about types of goods, we said when we sort of framed the discussion of types of goods, we put them together in what we call dichotomous pairs. That is, pairs of things which are opposite one another, normal goods and inferior goods in this case. Another example was substitutes and complements. And but in this case, when we talk about normal goods and inferior goods, we said normal goods are those which the demand to the left or the right responds in the same direction as income. So if incomes are rising for the demand side of the market, then it would appear that for normal goods, that we would expect demand to shift to the right for those normal goods. And what are those normal goods? Well, we said that most goods are normal goods, and so most goods are going to respond in that direction. So if one's income goes up, and it's not just because one's income has gone up because one's gotten a raise or a promotion or whatever, but it could be that this whole idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. During economic expansions, most people's incomes rise, sometimes dramatically, as we're starting to see it happening right now. We had a gross domestic product number that was just produced that was very, very hot yesterday, very strong. But unfortunately, we've also got strong inflation to go along with that. And when we come back from our exam in week 5, we'll talk more about what the issue is with inflation and growth, because inflation basically just waters down growth. And inflation is considered not a good thing. And there's lots and lots and lots of discussion right now within economics about what our Federal Reserve, our central bank, who we will talk much more about later, is going to do about it. But nonetheless, if incomes are rising, we can know the demand for goods will be rising. Okay, and if income is for normal goods, and if income is falling, demand for those normal goods will fall, and they'll rise for inferior goods. So inferior goods, the income effect works just in the opposite direction. So if we want to know what demand for goods in general is going to do, particularly normal goods, we can look at what's happening with incomes. And the data on incomes is pretty good, believe it or not. Because one of the reasons why macroeconomics became macro, that is sort of split away from micro back during the Great Depression, was there wasn't really very good data as to incomes. Business incomes a little better, but not so much household incomes. And it was really until we got an efficient measurement system around the 1940s that this started to become better. And now income measurement is very good, mostly because it's verified with tax information. And believe it or not, tax information is very accurate. It's very accurate. Yes, people can cheat on taxes, but it's kind of hard to cheat on W-2 income, which is reported by an employer who has generally no incentive to provide wrong information. Certainly not false information, but not even wrong information. So the income effect, it's easily measurable. We can know what happens to normal goods. Related to the income effect is something related but different. That's the wealth effect. And the wealth effect is, I say it's related because it's not really the same. Income can be defined very concretely as being the amount of inflow of resources measured in money, right? And over a certain period of time, like a year or a week or whatever. Whereas wealth is sort of a snapshot. So if this is a motion picture, this is a snapshot of where wealth is. And wealth can be accumulated over many, many years, over even many generations. Wealth can be intergenerational, that is, it can pass from one generation to another. So the wealth that people have today may not even have been earned by them in the first place. But the issue about how this affects demand is really critical, okay? Because it's how wealthy people are, or how wealthy they feel, And this is an important aspect of driving demand. If people feel wealthier than what they did prior, then they'll demand more, particularly normal goods. And remember, all luxury goods are normal goods. And so when people feel wealthier, they tend to demand, nicer vehicles, bigger houses. We've certainly seen, if you look at older homes, they're much, much smaller than newer homes. So people, and as they demand more homes, they demand more electricity and more home insurance, homeowners insurance and all that. So this feeling wealthier is interesting. And it is one that becomes a little bit difficult for economists to be able to quantify. And this is where behavioral economics has sort of gotten a big boost. In behavioral economics, I may have talked about this before, it's sort of the conjunction between economics and psychology. And there are economists who focus on this idea of how people feel determines how they behave, and how they behave affects the performance of the economy. And Richard Thaler being one of the sort of the key architects of the whole field of behavioral economics, Nobel Prize winner, and a very smart guy who follows this idea of feeling. And by feeling, it can be something like, the stock market is doing well, and the stock market has done well until about the last month or so. And so does that make you more or less likely to buy a new car? Probably more likely. A lot of households own stock, even if not directly through an individual investment account, then perhaps through a retirement account like a 401k or a pension or something like that. So if they feel wealthier, they tend to demand more. And if the stock market just plummets, and there are those who view the stock market as being very perilous right now and is set for a fall, and I think that they probably have a good point, then people are going to feel less wealthy and demand less goods, particularly luxury goods. And when we say feeling too, there's an issue here as well, because so much of American household wealth is bound up in real estate values. And we certainly saw people had where the wealth effect really took hold during the early part of the 2000s, which led up to the mortgage crisis and the financial crisis and economic crisis, all this, which was tied into people's probably overinvestment and over-enthusiasm in real estate, quite frankly. And people felt wealthier, and we had all these TV shows about, hey, you can get rich by buying a house for $50,000, put $10,000 into it, and then sell it for $100,000 or whatever, the so-called act of flipping, right? Well, I mean, the whole idea of remodeling homes is nothing new, but what is new is the idea that everybody feels like or that people who have no background in that feel like they could get involved in it, and it just sort of added to the mania. But people felt wealthier, and so we had a very strong economy as a result. The problem with that is that these values were overextended, and people immediately felt less wealthy once the values plummeted. So, and we could do a lot about this idea of bubbles within asset prices. There's a lot to talk about there, particularly in macro, and we'll probably come back to this a bit later over time. Okay, one big one that I think a lot of economists would probably prioritize and put at the top of the list would be a change in tastes and preferences, right? Or let's just say changes, plural, changes in buyers, because we're talking about the demand side here, buyers' tastes and preferences. And I think a lot of economists would say this is probably paramount, particularly given the fact of something we've talked about several times, several times before, and that is the idea that the vast majority of the output by private producers is done in creating our wants as opposed to our needs. Now, I realize healthcare could be considered more of a need, and that's a very big part of our economy, but a lot of other things are not so much. We don't really need, say, cable TV or iPhones or clothing, or expensive clothing, or as many pairs of shoes as like my wife has, or something like that. You kind of get the idea that these are true needs, compared to what you basically need. It's more wants, right? And that's really what we're covering here. And so people's tastes and preferences change. And when they do, let's say a good is now something new and it's in style, then the demand will shift to the right. If that thing goes out of style, then the demand shifts to the left as people get tired of it, or new goods come along to replace it, or these goods become obsolete in some cases. And so as a result, demand will shift to the left. And by the way, we shouldn't think of markets as being permanent things at all. We should think of individual markets, which is what this is. This PQ model is of an individual market for some individual good, whatever it is, shoes or toasters or whatever. And that they change, the market change, the demand changes, and we'll see supply change. And sometimes the demand for a good just goes so far to the left that it no longer even exists. So if there's no demand, there's no market. And so take goods for things like cassette tapes, that people used to use a lot to play music in their car or wherever. I don't know that they're really even made that much anymore. I'm sure you can find them somewhere, but there's not much of a market. I mean, obviously, digital technology has long ago replaced that. Don't even get me started on something like 8-track tapes, which are even older. And if you don't know what those are, that's a testament to how long I've been around. But you get the idea. That's an example of goods that are just fading away. Things like typewriters, sewing machines. Sewing machines are still out there, but not really. It's not much of a market. Very, very small market that exists for that. So buyers' tastes and preferences change. I was talking about this in my class yesterday, that one area where this demand is wildly all over the place is the entertainment industry, particularly for things like popular music. Somebody is in style and very hot, and suddenly, boom, demand shifts to the left. They're on top of the world, and a year later, nobody really cares because everyone's kind of moved on. And it's a really hard fall for those who think that maybe this is something permanent, and it is not. And markets are very temporary. And the thing that we should know about economics, if there's anything that you should carry from economics, is the fact that it's a very fragile system. Markets are fragile, the macroeconomy is fragile, and managing that is a delicate task. And things are going to change. Things are going to change, and you will see that things will change as you enter the labor force. Your jobs will change, your employers will change. Your employers will change names because they'll get bought by other companies, and so we shouldn't think that any of this is nailed down. These are more in Velcro. They could be lifted and moved back and forth. Okay, so tastes and preferences change as new goods come along, as goods lose fashion, lose style, whatever. Or sometimes goods are no longer even people don't like them because they're considered now to be dangerous. And you know, I remember when I was a kid that people used to use lawn darts, which are basically little needles with wings on them, where they would throw darts, you know, from long distances to hit targets, and they kept hitting kids and kept hitting kids and hurting children. So as a result, people decided that, you know, that was dangerous, and they, you know, not many people buy those anymore. So tastes and preferences change as a result. Sometimes the supply side causes it as well. That's why you don't see diving boards very much anymore. You almost never see a diving board at a hotel or a place like that. Okay, changes in taste and preferences. Also, how about this? So it's not the price of the good in question, whatever this good is, but the prices of related goods may impact the demand for a good. So related goods, and the related goods here are substitutes and complements. So we've brought in now two of the pairs we talked about earlier, normal goods and inferior goods, and now we're bringing in substitutes and complements. And what do we mean by this? Well, it basically means this. If let's say the good in question here is, say sugar, and the price of sweetener is much less expensive because maybe the price of sugar is rising because of, you know, taxes placed on sugar, and our government has done that in the past. And so as a result, people demand less sugar and more of some substitute like Sweet and Low, Splenda, Equal, whatever. So as a result, demand for sugar goes this direction. So while the price of maybe Splenda goes down, so does the demand for sugar. So they go in the same direction, price and the demand for this good, because people are buying more Splenda and Sweet and Low as a result of that substitute change. But it would be the price of that substitute. As far as complements go, they would go in the same. They would go in opposite directions, and that is if the price of hot dogs is rising, for instance, then people are going to demand fewer hot dogs, but they're also going to demand fewer hot dog buns, because why on earth would you buy hot dog buns if you're not buying hot dogs? Maybe the price of hot dogs is rising because of something, maybe a disease that has afflicted the pig population. So as a result, there's less pork to make hot dogs, and so price of hot dogs goes up. People demand fewer hot dogs, and also demand fewer hot dog buns. It has nothing to do with the price of the buns, which are probably the same. It's just that why would you buy hot dog buns without hot dogs? So you get the idea. So substitutes and complements are important, and there are ways that we measure these. And if you take micro, we will give some concrete demonstrations of what the tools are by which we measure the responsiveness of the demand for some good. In this case, maybe it's sugar or some other good, such as, you know, hamburgers or whatnot, to some of those other goods. Okay. Also, one that is probably pretty obvious here, and I'm just following along the list here that you're gonna see in your PowerPoint slides once I'm able to get it together. For whatever reason, the formatting is just not I've got the dropsies here. It's just not really working out, so we're going to try to figure that out. It's the number of buyers in the market, and this is really just a function. This is just what it is. It's nothing more complicated than this. It's the number of buyers who are available in a market, and a lot of times this is simply a function of population, right? It's the more people that come into a market, the more buyers that are potentially there for that particular good. There are some goods that probably wouldn't have much of a market if you didn't have many buyers available for it, but now because there are a lot of buyers, that good has taken off. And so as the global population rises, and as we're becoming more of a global economy, you're seeing lots and lots of goods just really have just a huge surge in demand. simply because of the fact that there are more buyers available to go into the market. So the number of buyers in a market or who are interested in a market. And remember, when we talk about demand, the definition of demand, it's the ability and willingness to buy goods at various prices and quantities. And so when we talk about buyers here, we're talking about people who are able and willing to be part of the demand side for that good. It would not include people who have the wherewithal to buy, a house or a new car or something like that. So it would have to be somebody who, is qualified to be in that market. So rightward shifts are oftentimes due to just simple population increases. A lot of economic growth in the 150 years since the beginning of industrialization can be tracked to population growth. And population growth creates demand for goods. Suppliers respond to that demand by producing goods. And it's this feedback cycle where buyers demand goods, suppliers produce them. As they produce them, they create more income, which gives more income to buyers to demand more goods, which leads on and on and on. So it's what we call a virtuous circle when the system works. And the system tends to work pretty well. It's not perfect. No one is saying that markets or the entire macroeconomy operates perfectly. But if you can contrast a market that is a mostly free market against command economies, and I think I went into this a bit on Tuesday, I think the debate is pretty much over on this. I don't think that too many people are arguing that command economies are better. Now, that's not to say that government involvement in certain areas might be desirable to certain societies. And certainly there's a great debate over what the government should do in healthcare. And frankly, our healthcare system is a mess. It really is. It was a mess before COVID. It's really a mess now. And it's not because of the providers who do an excellent job and they're dedicated workers in this particular field, but it's the system of how we finance healthcare, which is completely different than most everywhere else in the world, and which leads to a lot of people who pay zero for healthcare and some who pay a lot for healthcare. And it's simply because of the system of private insurance. And I know if you work for a private health insurance company, you're probably not going to like that comment, but I think it's a difficult proposition to maintain, particularly as the evidence continues to roll in. And once people got more health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, we saw health outcomes begin to improve a bit. And then COVID hit, and it's complicated a lot of things. So simply number of buyers in market. One more thing about this is this can also shift to the left, okay? And I was telling an example in another class about areas where populations are leaving. And I talked about the fact my mother, until she died, lived in a pretty industrial area, which was sort of in the process of deindustrializing. A lot of it had to do with the auto industry, which at the time was sort of appeared almost to be on its last legs until it got a government injection of help to help GM and Chrysler keep afloat. But that was not before a lot of suppliers went under. And in this area, there were entire strip malls that were no longer there because of the fact that people had left and they had gone to take jobs in other parts of the country, left town, did whatever they would do, and so as a result, you would see strip malls being taken out. I think there was one strip mall near her home, and I think there was one store left, and there was a Burger King, and that was it. that was the only thing that was left of that whole strip mall. So pretty depressing. So it could go either direction, left or right. So number of buyers in the market, simply put, is just simply a function really of the potential pool of would-be buyers. And then finally, a couple ones here are government policy, which really has to do with primarily taxation and regulation, but primarily taxation. And for those who are really against the idea of taxation and regulation, they sort of lump these together and call these taxulation. But taxation can really affect demand for goods, particularly, and remember we're talking about demand here, if it affects the demand side. So for instance, lots of goods have been taxed very heavily, and they seem to be real tax magnets: cigarettes, gasoline, alcoholic beverages. Now that we're seeing, increased legalization of cannabis, those are all goods which attract an extra level of tax, not just a regular sales tax, or what in New Mexico we call gross receipts tax, but a tax on top, a surtax. In other words, a tax on top of that, which sort of it falls into a generalized category called excise taxes. And these are, we get into this a little bit more in micro than we do macro, but it's certainly worthwhile talking about here. It's the idea that these are certain goods that are taxed because people will demand them. And demand has been shown to be very resilient, even growing over time, even as the tax for those goods rise. We certainly saw it in cigarettes. Demand for cigarettes is the tax on cigarettes is now so high that demand has actually begun to fall back a bit. It's hard to know whether or not it's because of the excessive amount of tax that certain areas have put on cigarettes, or whether or not it's just an increased awareness of the dangers of cigarette smoking. One would hope that it's the latter, right? Maybe one would hope it's even both. I don't know. No question that cigarettes are dangerous, but whether it's due to taxation or awareness, who knows? And regulation, one thing about regulation is the fact that it has less to do with demand and more to do with supply, but certainly there are regulated products that are going to affect demand for those goods, simply because they're unavailable in certain areas that have controls on things like guns, gun sales, and locations for those kinds of things, which primarily are federally regulated, but some localities have particular regulations on those. And so those would affect the ability to demand goods. And then the final one here is one that we're going to sort of build on. We're going to sort of expand this and blow it up a little bit. And that is a very general category of demand shifter, simply that we'll refer to as expectations. And as we get later in the course, we'll talk about an entire sort of school of thought, or maybe a way of looking at the world is maybe a better way of viewing it, called the rational expectations theory, which is not really one theory at all, but it's really a set of theories that talks about how demand for goods, it's primarily demand driven, is how demand is influenced by our expectations of the future. And in particular, it gets into this idea of government action. If we expect government to do things which are going to create inflation, then it might cause us to maybe buy goods now before the prices go up, because we expect wage increases to raise prices. So now we'll go out and buy a washing machine now instead of waiting a year from now. That's what our expectations do. This is the problem with inflationary expectations. We're going to be getting into inflation very soon and talking more about it. And it's a particularly timely discussion, given the fact that we're now seeing some real significant inflation. Inflation defined as a general rise in the price level, not just simply associated with one good like gasoline or healthcare, but all goods are simply rising in price. And for those of you who shop or look for goods, you'll see prices for goods rising pretty dramatically. And in some cases, they're rising faster than the overall rate of inflation. I think a lot of times it's just based upon the dynamic of firms just waiting until they feel like they can pull the trigger and raise the price, maybe 25% on particular goods. And I think I was at McDonald's. I bought my son something at McDonald's. I was really surprised at the price. I thought it was really high compared to what I remember. And I don't go to McDonald's very often, but I was a little surprised. So it seems like McDonald's has followed suit with a lot of other providers. Inflation expectations matter. They inform our demand for goods. And one of the things that we'll see with regard to inflation is if we expect the prices of goods to go up, we're going to demand more goods now as opposed to waiting, even if we have to borrow the money to do it. And that would be a logical response to anticipated inflation. Or anticipated anything, even the expectation of what the future might look like for us as an entire macro economy. If we feel like the economy is going to do well next year and going forward, and that we've gotten through the woods of all the difficulties with COVID and all the economic related problems, then maybe I'm more likely to buy a new car than I was a year ago, let's say, when there was a lot more uncertainty. And so I thought, I better hold off, just so I kind of know what's going on here a little bit. So if I feel good about it, I'm more likely to demand goods. And I and others like me, that is would-be buyers, are going to buy goods. If I feel, hey, whoa, things are looking very shaky, I don't think things are going well, I'm going to demand fewer, particularly luxury goods or high-end goods, what we call durable goods, that is goods which are expected to last a while, and are big ticket items that I might not want to engage in, particularly if I have to finance the purchase through borrowing. I mean, I want a 5-year note on a brand new car if I think the next 5 years is a pretty sketchy outlook. So anyway, that's what demand looks like. And when we get into talking about supply, it'll go much faster, mostly because some of the methodology of this increase, decrease, that is right, left, will have already been sort of covered. And things do go a little bit faster with that discussion. And we'll put both demand and supply together. And it was not my feeling that we'd get into chapter 6 today, which is why I didn't put it on the board. But does anybody have any questions for me about any of this? I guess I should have asked before I started erasing. But nonetheless, that's the beauty of Zoom. You can always back up, because I know we've got a few people on the live feed. Feel free to jump in if you do have questions. I'll take a little look at the text and see whether or not I'm missing any really good shifters there, but I don't really think so. These are the ones that sort of come to light as being the ones that are the most prominent of demand shifters. Okay, so we talked about demand. Well, obviously, there's another piece to the building block of markets, and that's supply, right? So, and again, we have heard the terms supply and demand our whole lives. And so what about supply? What is the definition of supply? Now, I will say this, because I think that sometimes people have an incorrect view of supply, where demand, I think, is pretty straightforward. I think sometimes people get a bit confused with supply by thinking supply is goods on hand, like inventory, or goods that are available for sale. And that's not really what's going on. In fact, inventory is not supply. Inventory is not supply. It's also not. It's not goods sitting around and whatnot. It's simply this. It's a very similar definition to demand, which has to do with it's a price and quantity related thing. Whether it's a functional relationship, and it's the ability and willingness of sellers, right, to provide output at various prices and quantities. And you'll see this in the PowerPoint slides once we get the formatting straight. I think I'm going to probably have to put those out of some Microsoft related products, because it doesn't seem to like Microsoft software. That's why we're encouraged not to use Internet Explorer with Brightspace. The ability and willingness of sellers to provide goods for sale at various prices and quantities. Okay. So that's a generic definition of prices and for supply. So it's not inventory, and I think that's we need to be clear that if you go into a store and find very little inventory, that's not a reflection of supply necessarily. It can be a function of a lot of things, notably the peculiarities of what's going on with that particular store, right? So we've certainly heard a lot about supply and supply chains, and the fact that we've got a restriction in supply. Well, that's an ability issue, right? We know that a lot of suppliers are simply not able to provide the output, and we've heard endless accounts of stories of ships being backed up one behind each other, trying to get into the port of Long Beach in Southern California, coming from Asia, which is where a lot of outputs are produced, but they simply don't have the labor to unload that, and they don't have the truckers to take the goods away, and so there's a real labor shortage, which is restricting supply. It's not a willingness issue; it's an ability issue. So we're seeing these supply constraints, and so that has really, been an issue, no question about it. And by the way, if supply is restricted, then there are fewer goods to go around, and that also contributes to inflation. So we've got kind of a double whammy going on with inflation, and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because we are going to talk about inflation. But you've got a demand issue where everybody who wants to work, I think, is working. I really believe that. I mean, the unemployment rate nationally is below 5%, which is really considered full employment. New Mexico's always had a slightly higher unemployment rate, about 1% higher than the national average. So we're about 5.8% as of the most recent reporting. That's pretty close to full employment too. I think that most people who want to work are able to find jobs. And I think one of the issues with New Mexico is that we've got a very large portion of the state that's extremely rural. And really, a lot of people live pretty far away from a lot of jobs. There are a lot of these communities where you really have to go a distance to get a job, and it's really going to pay you in order to do that. So, and a lot of states are rural, but we are, most of New Mexico is rural, quite frankly, even though those of us who live in the city don't always appreciate that. Okay, so supply constraints are an issue. We're going to talk about that when we get to inflation. So supply, the ability and willingness of sellers to provide goods at various prices and quantities. So this gives rise to the only other law of economics that I can think of. Even though in macro, we occasionally have some laws that are just, they're not really laws because they're sort of violated from time to time. So, but whereas there may be some goods that violate the law of demand, a very few sliver of goods, some very small subset of goods. I can't think of any goods that violate the law of supply. And that is, the law of supply expresses the direct relationship between price and quantity. So I can't think of any violators of this because it doesn't make sense that there would be violators. So it's direct relationship between price and quantity, and I'll go on to modify quantity by calling it Q sub S, the subscript S, quantity supply. I can't think of a reason why there'd be a violator here because it doesn't make sense. And that is that buyers, the connection between price and quantity is that the price of a good goes up, the quantity supplied of that good will also go up. And as the price of the good goes down, the quantity supplied of that good will also go down. So that should be enshrined as a law of supply that is pretty hard and fast. Pretty hard and fast. It doesn't really make much sense that there could be a lot of violation of that. Okay, so questions about the law of supply. I got the transcription on. I just kind of looked over here, and sometimes it kind of misconstrues what I'm saying. I'm trying my best to speak clearly, so that for those who like to rely upon that, that's good. I'm actually a little more visual of a person than auditory, so I kind of like seeing. I'm the person who has the thing at the bottom of the TV because I'd rather read the words than hear them a lot of times. So I am sensitive to that. So what about supply? Since we're talking about the other side of the market here, how does it look? What's going on with the supply side of the market? Well, we're going to be dealing, as we're going to be dealing frequently, with the first quadrant here. We've got some price against some quantity axis here. And supply is, because there's a direct relationship between P and Q, that is the two variables graphed on either axis, then we've got a direct relationship would have a positively sloped function. So as a result, you've got supply looking something like that. Okay, an upward sloping curve. And so when you've got some supply, it's basically as the price of a good goes up, suppliers are more willing to provide output. The price of a good goes down, they're less willing to provide some of that output. And we see this happening all the time when prices of goods are rising. There are a lot of sellers wanting to rush in and provide more goods. Maybe open at later hours, maybe offer more salespeople in order to be able to provide those goods, whatever the case might be. So for any random ordered pair here, we'll say the price of, let's just go with $40. And whereas we have some quantity that's associated, we'll call it Q1, associated with some $200, that some supply curve would look something like that. And just like in the case of demand, where supply itself, S1 here is just simply some demand curve that we could simply take a picture of because it's not going to be the same probably in a couple of years or whenever. Markets don't always change quickly. Sometimes they change very slowly, but it's mostly clear that they do change. And so if you've got something like a supply curve, remember that these things can move, right? And that they can shift. And but it's one thing to have a change in price. It's another thing to have a change in quantity. And so as a result, let's say that the price of good changes. And so now we've got some P1 now becomes P2. The price falls to 30. And now the quantity demanded falls to, say, 100, right? So again, what can we say about this? We can say that movements along the supply curve are due only to changes in price. This is the very same idea that we talked about with demand. It's the very same concept that movements along the curve are due only to changes in price. Okay. And when we talk about changes in price, we will simply use our sort of algebraic shorthand here, delta P. So delta P, which is the change in price. Movements along the S curve are due to changes in price. So as the price of a good comes down, suppliers are less willing to provide output, because it doesn't make sense to provide as much output. But by the way, what sometimes is missing from these discussions in textbooks is the idea of, okay, well then let's not produce as much output because the price is falling, but what do we do? Well, maybe we provide more of something else. So maybe we're selling fewer dress shoes, and so and the price is falling, we're not earning as much on dress shoes. Maybe now let's sell more athletic shoes, and so as a result, let's focus on that. So sellers will respond to price. And we're going to make a case that in most markets, the price is market determined, despite what I think sometimes we're led to believe in, I don't know, in everyday conversation where people have the idea that the business firms set prices and just try to get away with what they can, which is partly true, but it's also, yes, they'll try to get away with what they can, but then the market will let them know because the price is a signal that the price is either too low or too high. If the price is too low and people are banging down their doors, then they need to raise the price. If prices are too high and people are staying away, they need to lower the price. So the price mechanism tends to be efficient. It's not always quick, and it's not always, and the message is always received by sellers, which is another issue. But nonetheless, strictly from a market dynamic standpoint, the movement, any kind of movement along that curve is due to a change in price, and only a change in price. So I told you this is going to go a little faster than demand, mostly because we're covering a lot of the same ground. So what I am going to do now is simply talk about this. Well, we have the same S1 curve, right? Which again, the demand curve and the supply curve are both algebraic, can be expressed algebraically, right? So you got supply looking something like this, and we'll simply, let me make this so that it looks like there's an intercept here. That might be easier to describe. So you've got some S curve we'll call S1, and we'll pick an ordered pair here, and that corresponds to some P of 40 and some Q, which we'll call Q1 because it corresponds to S1 of 200 units. And as a result of this, we can say that S1, the equation for S1, might look something like this. And again, I don't really want to belabor the actual equations, other than to just sort of point out that when we have movements in these curves, they're due to something that's mathematically changing in the relationship between price and quantity. So you might have an intercept here of 20 plus 0.85 Q. In other words, that's price equals. S1 is price equals. Okay, that's the S1 equation. Price equals 20 plus 0.85 Q, meaning that you've got some sort of intercept here at 20, right? Whether it's drawn to scale or not is irrelevant. A lot of times these don't really appear like they're drawn to scale, but it's not the drawing that makes sense, it's the relationship between the variables. And again, you've got a positive slope here on the coefficient, which is an upward sloping curve. And so as a result, you've got something that's happening here. That's what the supply equation looks like right now. But what if there's a rightward shift? What if supply is changing and now supply moves to the right, and now supply is not S1, supply is now S2, meaning that at a price of 40, now the quantity that's associated with S2 is, say, 400. Same price, but a different amount. And by the way, this is why I say don't go with up, down, go left, right, because look what's going on here. This rightward shift looks like supply is actually going down. It's not going down, it's going to the right. But you've got, this is the way this thing is sloped. And if it decreases to the left, it looks like it's going up. So if you think up, down, you're going to be misled when you get to supply. So think right, left when you talk about these shifts. And so a rightward shift in supply, just like in demand, is an increase in overall supply. So a rightward shift in supply is an increase in overall supply. And a leftward shift in supply is a decrease in overall supply. So if supply were to shift, say, to this direction, to the left, then what it means is less quantity at every price. So now at the same P of 40, now Q3 is, say, 100, right? So just to make sure that we have this, and you have this in your notes, and so you can sort of lock it into your thinking here, let's just describe these shifts and what the effect is on price and quantity. So So a rightward shift in supply. And this is going to exactly mirror what we've talked about with demand. A rightward shift in supply is an increase in overall supply, which is again different from a movement along the curve, which is due only to a change in price. A rightward shift in supply is an increase in overall supply. In other words, the entire function has changed. And what it means is more quantity supplied at every price. Okay. And then a leftward shift, right? A leftward shift in supply is a decrease in overall supply. And that is a less quantity supplied at every price. Okay, and I believe this is, enumerated for you in the PowerPoint package, which I will be getting to you again. I promise I will. And again, what is going on here is nothing about the price of the good. Okay, we're simply talking about something that's non-price related that is affecting the equation. So in the case of S2 then, right, and all I really am emphasizing here is this idea of the fact that these are actual equations. So what's going on with S2? Well, it's an increase in overall supply, meaning it's got now a lower intercept point, so maybe it's now 10, plus the same slope, because these do look mostly parallel. And as a result, this is going to cut into the vertical axis at a lower point. S3 goes in the other direction then, where we have a higher intercept point, where maybe it's now, say, 50, or maybe it's 30, okay? Maybe it's 30 at the same 0.85 cube. 0.85 being the slope of the curve, slope of the line, right? So rightward shift is an increase in overall supply, more quantity supplied at every price. A leftward shift is a decrease that is less quantity supplied at every price. And so now we get to the idea of supply shifters that are known as the determinants of supply, which just in the case of demand are these non-price variables. So nothing about the price of the good is shifting the entire curve. In other words, the snapshot that we took of S1 doesn't apply because it's moved on to S2, it's moved back to S3. And so as a result, the market is changing and it's something different. So let's talk about what these shifters are. I'm going to go erase this mostly because I think this is kind of redundant with where we were with demand. This is why I think the supply discussion goes a little bit faster. It is the sense that we're talking about the same playing field here. So it's the same direction. To the right is an increase, to the left is a decrease. So there's nothing that's terribly different there about that. What is different, however, is are the components of supply, because supply is different than demand, which I think goes without saying, but let's talk about what those determinants of supply are. Now, unlike demand, where we said that, okay, some economists might prefer that the changes in tastes and preferences be the biggest priority for number one on the list of demand shifters, that is determinants of demand, because most of the goods that we want are wants-based as opposed to needs-based. Fair enough. But here in supply, I think there's one that is preeminent, and it's above all because it's so important, and that is changes in the cost of production. Changes in the cost of production. This is critical. And the reason I say this is because of the fact that every supplier has got a cost of production. There is no such thing as a zero cost provider. We hear some of these fantastic stories about it's provided to at zero cost or whatever. It could be that the firm is able to supply something, some additional product at very little cost, but it's not zero cost altogether, because you have to have some kind of cost in order to exist, even if it's an opportunity cost, which we're going to make the case that opportunity costs are never zero. Remember, opportunity costs are the value of giving up something in order to do whatever it is you are doing. And so the fact that we are always giving up something, I could be, I don't know, doing something else. I could be, driving a semi right now instead of teaching economics. I don't know if that's exactly what I would want to do, but you get the idea. There's always something that we're giving up in order to do something as opposed to the other. So there are costs at all times. But this is so important that it really deserves mention as sort of a prominent thing. And that is if you have a change in the cost. If we talk about something like total cost, right? Total cost is basically what it costs to produce output. And if the total cost is going up to produce something, then the supply of that something is going to shift to the left. And this is very simple. Why? Because if it costs you more to do something, you're going to do less of that something. And conversely, if the cost of doing that thing goes down, then whoever's doing the supplying is going to do more of that simply because of the fact that it's less expensive to do whatever it is one is doing. And again, just like in the case of providing less output as the price of the good goes down, that is less quantity, supply can shift because it costs less to do something or costs more to do something. If it costs more to do something, maybe suppliers completely leave the market altogether. It's too costly to do business. If I'm a coal mine operator and I find it's just too expensive to extract the remaining coal from this particular project, I can just simply walk away from it. And therefore I shift. My individual supply shifts to the left, but then the entire market supply shifts left as a result of my exit from it, simply because maybe the cost of production relative to what I'm getting out of it is too high. And so as a result, I walk away. And suppliers walk away from markets all the time. So shifts to the right, shifts to the left are not unusual at all. They go on all the time. These are, once again, micro markets. This is a market for whatever the good in question is, whether it's sugar or shoes or pizza or coal, right? So changes in the cost of production really matter a lot. And it's going to matter in particular as we get a little bit deeper into this list here, because we'll talk about where government might fit into this picture. Another one that's really important, and it's sort of the story of the Industrial Revolution, and that is changes in technology. And what's interesting about this, for those of you who are interested in technology, I think a lot of us are, is the sense that this tends to be a shift only in one direction, that's to the right. And that is changes in technology, and we could say in innovation or in creation or inspiration or invention, whatever, usually result in mostly rightward shifts. It doesn't make sense, in fact, that you could have a leftward shift in supply as a result of some change in technology. Why on earth would you adopt as a supplier a technology that was less productive than what you already have? It is, and I'm not saying this has never happened before in any isolated instance where maybe a farmer has scaled down his operation and decided to go with a smaller tractor than before, maybe an older model, maybe gets sold the other one off. That could happen, I suppose. But from an entire market standpoint, that really doesn't happen. In fact, it's just the opposite. What tends to happen is the fact that as technology gets better, suppliers have to adopt that new technology. Why? Because they can't stay competitive otherwise. And it's not been all that long ago where there were business firms that were resistant to the idea of even going with computers. I mean, today that sounds completely insane, but it hasn't been all that long ago. I was in banking up to about 15 years ago. There were firms that didn't use computers very much. You would want to send somebody an email, they didn't have email. I mean, today that just seems completely insane, and it pretty much is. I can't think of any firm that doesn't have, I mean, there are still firms that don't have websites. It's amazing, but they don't have websites. You've got to get there. You've got to have email. You've got to have technology. I mean, it's like not having a phone. It just doesn't make any kind of sense. But why would you have a phone if nobody else has a phone, right? So the fact that your competitors have phones means you've got to get phones. And the fact that your competitors get websites means you've got to get websites. So a lot of this technological innovation is changing behavior of suppliers because they have to. They have no other choice. They have no other choice but to adopt technology. If you had only 2 grocery stores in town and the Smiths and Albertsons, and say Albertsons was the first to arrive at the scanning technology, then Smiths would have to adopt scanning technology because who would want to wait longer for somebody to manually do what somebody could do quicker with the scanning technology. So innovation forces suppliers to catch up and adopt new technology, but in doing so, it makes them more efficient. It makes them more efficient, and we have seen before, and another story that is part and parcel of the Industrial Revolution is jobs going away, being replaced by technology. There are many, many fewer cashiers than what there used to be. And contrary to the idea that technology replaces workers, it doesn't. It replaces them in the very short run, but workers go on to other things and don't have the same job. I mean, there are very few people who work as telephone operators. It used to be a job, a telephone operator. It used to be elevator operators. Which is kind of incredible in its own right. The jobs have been replaced by technology. There used to be secretaries, a lot of secretaries. That doesn't really exist either. If you want to reach somebody, you leave them a voicemail or send them an email or whatever. You don't need somebody to physically take your messages and whatnot. So yes, jobs are replaced, but it makes the overall workforce more productive. And that productivity results in a rightward shift. No question about it. And that's really been the story of what industrialization has been about. And I'm not saying industrialization has been without problems. There's no question that there are issues with it, but nonetheless, that there is no denying that is a factor, okay? So changes in technology also related to what we talked about before is simply the number of sellers in a market. This is, again, as in the case of buyers, it is what it is, right? It's the number of sellers in a market. More sellers come in, there's a rightward shift. Sellers go out, there's a leftward shift. For whatever reason, maybe there's a limitation on the number of sellers. Some states and localities have a limitation on the number of sellers who can provide certain goods like liquor. Liquor licenses are sometimes hard to come by, or licenses to do things like be pest inspectors or home inspectors. There may be a limitation on those. Sometimes these industries and these professions themselves will influence the particular regulation so as to keep outsiders out. And so as a result, there could be fewer sellers in a market, or there could be more sellers in a market, whatever the case might be. More sellers, rightward shift, fewer sellers, leftward shift. That could change as a result of simple regulation, but also just population. Also, government policy has an effect here and here. So I'm kind of moving a little bit quickly through because some of this is a bit repetitious, but taxation and regulation. Regulation is probably more of a relevant piece to supply than it is to demand. It certainly does have relevance to demand, but it's probably more relevant to supply. And that is, regulation tends to raise the cost of doing business. Anything that raises the cost of doing business makes firms not want to do as much of that. There have been cases in which firms have simply gone out of business or shut down doing what they're doing simply because they don't want to comply with the regulatory controls. Or will leave the country in order to do something else somewhere else. Maybe they don't like minimum wage laws in California or whatever, and they'll move to another country. Or don't like minimum wage laws in the US generally. And that's a regulation. And so you get the idea. And taxation could be just another example of cost. If taxation is the cost of doing business, then if taxes are rising, supply tends to shift left. And if taxes are falling, then supply will tend to shift right. So it's very similar to a cost of doing business. It's got to be factored in to the overall supply equation. Okay. And then the final one here, before we move on and put demand and supply together, is this idea of business outlook. And this can simply be summarized in the term forecasts. And forecasts are simply, well, like they're a weather forecast. They're pretty close to being right, usually, not always. Sometimes they're wildly wrong, just like weather forecasts are wildly wrong, but not very often. Whereas maybe Channel 13 says the high today is going to be 48, maybe it comes in to be only 46, right? Pretty close. It's not, we're not going to, hold their feet to the fire for being off a little bit. Just like forecasters are maybe a little bit off, but they come close enough that it gives an idea of how to deal with things. But the idea of supply decisions being impacted by it really has to do with optimism and this idea of expectations. And when we talk about expectations, this is really where some of the rational expectations school of thinking comes from. What do businesses rationally expect to happen in the coming days, months, whatever, and it'll affect their supply decisions. If they feel good about things, they will, decide to supply more. If they feel bad about things, they may want to supply less and dial back their forecasts and dial back their supply decisions. And so we'll get to that a bit later. There are other examples here as well. Probably interest rates should factor in this as well, particularly from a macro perspective, because we will see how interest rates do affect a particular element of macro demand. But I'd like to hold off on that a bit until we sort of get into some of the definitions of those demands in general. So, okay, so we've got about 10 minutes, and what I want to do is sort of wrap up chapter 3. And when I don't get done in chapter 3, I just probably have just a few minutes, a fragment remaining, and then I can get into chapter 6 on Tuesday. But it's this: let's put both of these guys together. Let's put demand and supply together. And so, as a result, on a PQ plane, we've got a downward sloping demand curve. And if you've been reading the text, this is now familiar looking to you. An upward sloping supply curve looking like that. And so that X formation should now be pretty familiar to you. And so supply and demand. Now, they're opposite sloped, and it's really a reflection of the differing sides reaction to price, really. Sellers want high prices and buyers want low prices, which is why their quantity decisions are based upon either high or low, depending upon what side of the market you're on. That is not exactly a Nobel Prize winning economic statement that sellers want high prices and buyers want low prices. But it is reflected here sort of graphically for those who like more graphically oriented. And the sweet spot here that we should talk about is this meeting of the minds. This is the compromise position where we arrive at price. And this price is what we consider, is what we call an equilibrium price. An equilibrium price is simply referred to as P with a little asterisk that we pronounce P star. And so everywhere in economics, wherever you have a little asterisk as a superscript on a variable, it usually refers to some equilibrium condition. Equilibrium is simply defined as a relative state of short-term balance in a market. Okay, a relative state of short-term balance. And just like this idea that demand curves, you need to take a picture of them because they're going to change. Same with equilibrium. And the reason equilibrium is going to change is because demand and or supply are going to change. So it's a state of short-term balance. But in this case, and equilibrium is not just confined, obviously, to economics. I mean, there's equilibrium in nature, there's equilibrium in physiology. We all know that we have an equilibrium body temperature. It doesn't mean that our body temperature can't get too high at times, but then if we're lucky, it returns to an equilibrium, natural state sort of thing. So equilibrium is really a state of nature. I think it's what we're talking about. But equilibrium is really, it's got two manifestations as to price and quantity. So either axis. So as a result of this, we have a equilibrium quantity. And equilibrium quantity then is simply known as Q star. Okay, Q star. So again, everywhere we have a little asterisk that we simply pronounce star, we're talking about an equilibrium value. That is some sort of balance, which will change over time. Now, the thing about this that's interesting, particularly about quantity, is the idea that it also represents a sort of state of equality where what? The quantity supplied in the market equals the quantity demanded in the market, more or less. This is an important aspect for us to be aware of, that this is where the meeting of the minds comes about. Right? Yeah, sellers would like higher prices. What sellers wouldn't like higher prices? Sellers want higher prices just like any seller, right? Including a seller of labor. If you're a worker, tell me a worker who thinks that his or her wage isn't too low, right? I can't tell you how many workers I've ever come across who have said, oh, I make enough, I make too much, right? It just never happens. It's human nature. We never earn enough as a supplier of output. But we have to accept what we're able to do, what someone who's willing to pay us is willing to pay us. Just like sellers at pizza makers would love to sell Domino's pizza for $50 a piece, if they could. And if buyers are willing to pay it, you can bet they would take $50, right? But buyers aren't willing to pay $50 for a pizza, no matter how big it is. And so as a result, they'll settle for 15 or whatever the price would happen to be. And so if they can make that work in their own particular cost scheme, they'll do it. And if they can't, they won't, and they'll leave, right? And they'll go on to do something else. And somebody else will try, or the demand seller to figure out 15 is too low. I can't get pizza at 15. I will have to except 20 or whatever, but maybe not 50 ever, right? So equilibrium quantity is the point at which both demand side and supply side come together and say this is the price at which our quantities will equal each other, and therefore the price tells us things. It's an information mechanism, particularly the supply side. I think the supply side understands what's going on, and that is if you're a supplier of goods and goods are flying off your shelves and people are backed up in the parking lot, you can't get in to buy your goods, you should probably think about raising your prices. And if goods are sitting around gathering dust, you should probably think about lowering your prices. So pricing is a mechanism that should tell you how to clear quantities so that the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. And by the way, when we talk about these quantities, we're talking not about supply. Supply is the willingness and ability to provide output at various prices and quantities. Quantity is the exchange, what gets exchanged in the market, okay? That's what's really going on. It's what gets exchanged in the market, okay? One final thing here, and then we're about out of time, and that is this. What about conditions of disequilibrium? That is, what about a case in which, for whatever reason, this price is set somewhere here, for whatever reason? Well, now we have a problem, don't we? Because if you take the intercept of these two functions here, then we have a quantity supply that's out here and a quantity demanded that's out here. So now we have a disequilibrium condition. We have a disequilibrium condition where the quantity supplied is now greater than the quantity demanded. In other words, we have a surplus. And that's an out of equilibrium condition because the price is simply too high, whatever the price is. And so again, this is how suppliers understand that the price is wrong, is because there is a surplus, the price is set wrong. So that's an out of equilibrium condition. Likewise, you could have a condition where you got an upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, and what would be an ordinarily an equilibrium point here, an equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, where now the price is set too low for whatever reason. And so now what have we got? We've got quantity demanded out here and quantity supplied out here. You've also got an out of equilibrium condition because the equilibrium price is here, but the actual price is here. Well, if the quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied, then what have we got going on here? We've got a shortage. This is when buyers are banging on your door, they can't get enough of it. You should think about raising your price. And so the response to this, which is really a supply response, is to, number one, if you've got a surplus that goods aren't moving, the quantity that you want to supply exceeds the amount that buyers are willing to demand, then the price needs to come down, and you'll walk the price down until you get to equilibrium. And by doing that, you'll eventually restore the demands. You'll eventually restore the quantity demanded to a point which they will want to reach equilibrium as well. And in the case of a shortage, the supplier will want to walk the price up. And by so doing, buyers will say, okay, we're willing to pay a little bit. It's like the $15 pizza, okay, we're willing to pay 20. And so as a result, the shortage is cleared. And one final thing that I'll say about equilibrium is that what looks like it may just strictly be, thinking out loud on a whiteboard or chalkboard or whatever, really can be evidenced by our experience within real markets. And that is, how often do you see, how often do you walk into let's say a retail, like a Home Depot or whatever, and you just find the entire shelves just wiped out, right? And you sometimes see it if they're restocking or moving things around or whatever, but you rarely see just a wipe out. There's no lumber at all at Home Depot. It just doesn't really happen very much. Where there's just a gigantic shortage of something that's very critical, or key items just missing, right? Going into Walgreens and finding no pain reliever, right? No Tylenol, no Motrin. That doesn't really happen. So shortages really are infrequent. Which is not to say they never happen, because they do, and particularly in times of crisis, we see it. And I think the COVID crisis was certainly, well, the fact that we're calling it a crisis certainly makes that qualify for that. So that's one example. Also, you rarely walk into a place and you are stumbling over goods because there's just an excess, there's just a supply, people are staying away, nobody wants to buy them. So suppliers are pretty good at figuring out these supply decisions, and they're pretty good at forecasting demand. And again, I come back to something I've talked about before, and that's the idea that suppliers have got probably a bigger burden than the demand side, because not only do they have to figure out what's going on with the demand side, what they're thinking, what they want to do, but they've also got to figure out their own issues as well as those of their competitors. And so they've got a big burden. And so a lot of when I say that how these surpluses and shortages clear, it's usually because it's the suppliers that make the change. And frankly, we don't have a culture of haggling where the demand side argues over the price of the good. It's usually a take it or leave it proposition. And they pretty much vote with their feet, buyers do. They don't like the price, they just don't buy it. There are very few goods that we engage in haggling over the price. And that's unlike other cultures in the world where people will argue over the price of anything, a hairbrush or a scarf or whatever. We don't really do that. In fact, if you do that here, you're probably looked at as being a little bit unstable, quite frankly. Even though in other parts of the world, that would be pretty logical. So, all right. So anyway, that does it for most of what we're going to do. There's just a bit of a fragment of chapter 4, chapter 3 that I'm going to do on Tuesday. And then I'll jump into really an introductory bit of chapter 6, which is really that our first turn toward focusing on all macro all the time from that point. So questions for me about anything we've talked about? I think I kept you about a minute over. So my apologies for that. Okay, well, if there are no questions, we'll call it a day. And I wish everybody a good weekend. Feel free to get with me if you have questions, and I will see you on Tuesday.